One thing's for sure though, I do see a lot of potential in Resident Evil 7, and I hope dearly that Capcom plans to revisit this idea sometime down the line with a bigger and better game. Good lord, it's like my dream came true! As much as I loved Resident Evil 7, I felt that they didn't take the idea far enough, and I was really hoping they'd give the concept another try. Lo and behold, Resident Evil 8 is exactly that. It takes the foundation that they started with Resident Evil 7 and not only expanded upon it, but added a ton of new features to boot. Unfortunately, it is far from perfect, and in so many ways. It feels like this game might have been overambitious, but where it counts, Resident Evil 8 is a ton of fun and well worth playing. The story picks up right after Resident Evil 7, and it actually opens up with a brief summary of the previous game. After rescuing his wife Mia from the Baker estate, Ethan meets up with Chris Redfield, who relocates them to an isolated town in the middle of Europe. Years later, a cozy evening is interrupted when Mia gets assassinated, and by who else?
Chris? What the hell?
Sorry, Ethan.
No! What? Why?
Chris shows up, murders Ethan's wife, and kidnaps their child. One thing leads to another, and Ethan finds that his baby is in the custody of a group of powerful weirdos who are running a small village full of werewolves. Ethan needs to navigate the horrors of the village, battle the four lords, and escape with baby Rose, all while figuring out what Chris's deal is and how Umbrella is involved yet again. The storytelling falls into its own trap that I feel is so rarely pulled off well. If you're gonna have a previous hero turn into an antagonist, you gotta go all in. You can't do this by halves, or the reveal at the end is going to be really disappointing. To be fair, Resident Evil does it well enough, but it feels like it's grabbing random plot devices out of thin air, which I suppose might be par for the course in this franchise. Anyway, it's not as dumb as Survivor or Dead Aim, but I'd say the plot is almost equal to Revelations, which is not a compliment at all. It's such a shame because so much of what surrounds the plot is incredible. The vistas are downright gorgeous, and the little details in the houses are fantastic too. Very few things necessarily jump out at me, but everything comes together as a whole very well, and the environments feel pretty natural. Best of all are the character models and facial animations. I say this was pretty much perfected already back in Devil May Cry 5, but Resident Evil 8 is either equal to it, or might have even managed to surpass it. That's not to say that there aren't any flaws whatsoever. This scene where Alcina sits down to look at a mirror? Yeesh, what happened to that frame rate? You can see a perfect side-by-side comparison between the real Alcina and the mirror, and there is something wrong here. I'm going to assume that this is the PlayStation 5 struggling to render 4K, and to be fair, it doesn't look that bad anyway. In fact, since I have to nitpick little things like this, it goes to show how great the game looks overall. Then you've got the characters themselves, and it's hard not to compare them to the Bakers. I'm not quite sure which family I prefer more, but I do like how the Bakers were much smaller and more intimate. You spend a lot of time with each individual character throughout the game, and you really get to know them. In Resident Evil 8, each chapter is dedicated to a specific character, but you run through their sequences fairly quickly, and the different antagonists don't interact with each other too much. It starts off promising enough with Dimitrescu in the castle, but the following chapters are much shorter by comparison. I really wish I could spend more time in some of these locations, but I'm shuffled off to the next event too quickly. Now that I think about it, each segment in this game seems to be attempting a completely different style. The castle is more like a traditional Resident Evil game, and it gave me high hopes early on. A lot of rooms and paths crisscross into each other, and you can accomplish most of the objectives in whatever order you like. It's awesome. But then you get to the next chapter, which is laid out like an escape room puzzle, and then later on like a haunted house. It's pulled off well, but this isn't quite what I'm here for. The next two chapters are mainly a mix of on-rail set pieces and tons of combat. And then the game's over. What happened to that castle? The level design was excellent, and it goes to show how much can be done with this style of game. But then they drop it and don't bother going back to that approach. It's so disappointing. But I'd better touch on the general gameplay and pacing before I go further into this. For those familiar with Resident Evil 7, it's more of the same. It's a very slow-paced first-person shooter that's designed around a more defensive approach rather than an offensive one. You'll need to pick your targets quickly and carefully, ammunition and supplies are meant to be very limited, and blocking attacks at the right time goes a long way to helping prevent damage. Newly added is a pushback mechanic, where successfully blocking an attack can allow the player to push the enemy away. It doesn't always work out so great, but it is a welcome addition. Perhaps the most interesting inclusions here are the ones that lean the game closer towards Resident Evil 4. There's a merchant for the player to shop at, treasure can be collected for more money, there's no item box, but instead a much larger inventory space that can be upgraded down the line. A variety of weapons can be collected and their stats individually upgraded. It's practically Resident Evil 4 Remake. Although, not quite. Resident Evil 4 was much more linear and action-packed, even going so far as to have end-of-level summaries to show how well the player is doing. Resident Evil 8, on the other hand, is much more of an adventure. There's a ton of optional content off the beaten path for players who like to explore, and these can lead to hidden treasure or even secret boss fights. I almost find it hard to believe that Resident Evil 8 doesn't double down on this aspect, because I feel like that's where the game is at its strongest. And since so much of this is optional, it doesn't get in the way too much, so it won't hurt the replay value. As it is, however, the game is too short and there just aren't enough of these secrets lying around. One of my biggest complaints with Resident Evil 7 was the lack of enemy variety, and they pulled it off a lot better this time around. You've got the regular cannon fodder zombies, but then you have the much faster and aggressive werewolves, the annoying flying monsters, and a surprisingly large variety of cyborg variants. I would have liked it if we could just have a few more enemy types, but thankfully the boss fights do help make up for this. It's still mostly hit and run tactics, as is the case for most of these Resident Evil games, but an emphasis on specific weak points and some cool arena layouts go a long way in elevating their quality. It's a shame then that there are only 3 major boss fights that rely on the core gameplay. Another 2 fights are basically fancy set pieces, and others still are mainly just tougher normal enemies that also summon reinforcements. It can be a bit blah at times, and the final boss takes a ton of hits to go down. But at least it's not another wall of meat this time, and it is mostly good at what it sets out to do. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the enemy tethering. After all, I complained about it in Resident Evil 3 Remake, and I hate to say it, but it's made its return here. Escaping a pursuing boss by going into a save room is fine. I mean, it's goofy, but for the sake of gameplay purposes, I get it. But for these normal enemies, there's like an invisible line in the ground that they refuse to cross. I'm sure this was designed to make it possible to run away from enemies if you're low on supplies, or to help with knife-only runs, or whatever. But this takes it way too far. In a more extreme example, you can have an enemy chase the player from room to room, but then they suddenly disappear and teleport to their originating space. I'm not entirely sure how this game was meant to be balanced, especially for a horror game. At least there are plenty of tight corridors where combat is encouraged, if not mandatory, so I want to say that the odd enemy behavior doesn't quite ruin the game, but I don't like how it's implemented either. Other than that though, the enemy AI is pretty good and fun to fight against. They often try to dodge your shots, but you can learn their movements with enough practice, and it makes for some pretty intense fights. It's difficult to get too deep into this game without spoiling some aspects and ruining the surprise for those who actually want to play it for themselves. But the general gist of the game goes like this. You've got about 6 chapters to go through, with the 4 in the middle being the meat of the game. Each chapter takes place in a separate corner of the map, with its own environmental themes, unique enemies, and a boss fight or 2 to go through. In between the chapters, the titular village acts as the game's hub, and keys are collected little by little to open up more areas with treasure, weapons, and animals to hunt down. Their meat can be collected and cooked into meals to provide the player with permanent upgrades.
I can hardly wait. Just excuse me a moment. Apologies for the wait. Here's your share. To think such a dish could be had in this winter-bound frontier.
There's some pretty well done progression here, and best of all, since so much of this is optional, you can skip this stuff on subsequent playthroughs. Of course, you'll be missing out on powerful upgrades if you do so, but that's a balance you'll need to figure out. There are some really weird aspects about this game though, which come off as poor planning. For starters, a crafting system isn't necessarily anything new. Most Resident Evil games have the player combine herbs for more powerful healing items, and some of the games offer different kinds of gunpowder to create ammunition. Resident Evil 8, however, takes the concept in a direction that I don't think I approve of. While crafting supplies would normally occupy valuable inventory space, they can now be held infinitely in a separate crafting menu. See, a big part of Resident Evil is inventory management, but in this game, I was never worried about running out of healing supplies or ammunition, because I can freely stockpile crafting supplies. By the end of the game, I could craft over 10 healing potions, each of which fully heals me. And that's nothing to say of the ammunition and explosives besides. Speaking of which, the game is very insistent on reminding you to craft your leftover supplies. Why would I do that? The materials aren't going to expire and they don't take up any space. I'm actually better off not crafting them unless I really need to. There's probably an option that turns this message off, but I'm surprised how this keeps showing up all the way to the final boss. It's so weird, I feel like this wasn't really thought through. If these crafting supplies took up inventory space like in every other Resident Evil game, then this would be a lot more interesting. I'd have to make choices on what supplies I value the most. But the way it is here is a lot more brain dead, and I don't think it quite lines up with the franchise's values. The weapons are another disappointment. It has the same basic idea as Resident Evil 4, but it comes off as a poor facsimile. Each new weapon is simply a straight upgrade with little in the way of choice or playstyle. I mean, choice does come into play, especially with how quickly your money can disappear into weapon upgrades towards the end of the game, so you have to decide on which weapons you value more, and that's fine, I don't have anything against that. But Resident Evil 4 did a much better job at differentiating the weapons. Most people would probably scoff at the Punisher pistol's lower firepower, as would I, but did you know that it can also pierce through shields? And the Striker shotgun is no doubt a favorite for most, but I never really cared for the lower aiming position, and the supposed shorter range always made me worried that I wasn't getting the most bang for my buck. And that's a big part of what made Resident Evil 4 so great. Each individual weapon had its own identity and playstyle. This also helps with the replay value a ton, as focusing on different weapons can offer a unique experience. With Resident Evil 8, the latter two pistols have automatic fire, and the last shotgun has a greater capacity and superior reload speed. And that's it. There's really not much to it. It's such a shame to think about what could have been. However, it is worth noting that, similar to Ethan's previous adventure, Resident Evil 8 is very short. I beat it in 12 hours and I really took my time. By comparison, Resident Evil 4 was about twice that length. I'm not even sure Resident Evil 8 has the breathing room to bother differentiating the weapons more than they already are. By the time you would start to get significant differences in the upgrades, the game would be almost over anyway. And it doesn't help that the middle two chapters have significantly less combat too. Kinda makes them feel like they're filler. It's an odd situation where I find Resident Evil 8 to be significantly superior to Resident Evil 7, but also a lot more disappointing. I didn't have as much of an expectation going into Resident Evil 7, and the game's presentation does make it feel very small, so you kind of have an idea of what to expect early on. Resident Evil 8, with the larger roster of characters, the exploration, the treasure hunting, the seemingly large and open map, the much higher stakes than last time, it sets up this idea that it's going to be something much bigger and more extravagant. And I suppose it is, but it stops short of its real potential. It's almost as if they tried really hard on the first quarter of the game, and then they had to wrap things up quickly and give up on their other ideas. Well, at least the additional content is a lot better than in the previous game, which, if you might recall, Resident Evil 7 had nothing, aside from a higher difficulty level, and that's it. Plenty of paid downloadable content was released down the line, and a free epilogue was thrown in a year after the game came out. Nowadays, you can get all this bundled into a single package with the Gold Edition of Resident Evil 7, and I would encourage that, it's pretty great. But the point I'm trying to make is that Resident Evil 7 had, quite literally, no additional content at launch, which was disappointing for a series so well known for that. I already talked all about it in that game's review, so enough of that. Anyway, it's great that Resident Evil 8 picks up the slack and offers a total of 3 avenues in this regard. And they're not so great. First off, there's New Game Plus. Now, don't get me wrong, this on its own is awesome. You keep your weapons and upgrades from the previous run, and you can go through the whole game again. It's a feature I wish more games would implement. However, much like Resident Evil 3 Remake, the game is once again designed around completing a series of lame challenges. Things like crafting a ton of items and killing several enemies with each weapon. Thankfully, it's not nearly as bad as Resident Evil 3 Remake, but it still retains that same odd aspect about how infinite ammo can be unlocked pretty easily. It doesn't prevent the acquisition of achievements either, making this another fairly easy platinum trophy to get as long as you're willing to grind it out. But who would do that? You'd have to be some kind of a nerd. Then there's the Mercenaries. This minigame is always awesome, and it's one of my favorite parts of any Resident Evil game that has it. And that's why it pains me to say that this is the Mercenaries in name only. Hardly any of it shares a real identity with the previous Mercenaries titles. Instead of having a collection of different characters to choose from, each with their own unique loadouts and sometimes even special abilities, here you only play as Ethan and you have access to a shop to build your arsenal throughout the game based on how much money you collected through each level. That's already way off from what makes Mercenaries so great, but it only gets worse. Instead of fighting in an arena with tons of enemies coming after you, this version of Mercenaries takes place in maze-like maps with different branching paths and plenty of dead ends. Enemies also don't spawn into the game until certain conditions are met, which usually involves entering or leaving a certain room to activate the appropriate triggers. What this turns into is a lot of trial and error to figure out what path you're supposed to take to keep up the combo all the way to the end. Now look, it's not totally unusual to build the Mercenaries around specific enemy spawns. Resident Evil 6 did this, and I think that version of the Mercenaries is fantastic. However, most of these games take place within simple enclosed arenas with enemies constantly coming after the player, not traversing from point A to point B with an unclear path. It can be argued that it's closer in line to the original Mercenaries in Resident Evil 3 on the PlayStation 1. And you know what? That's fair, I can see that argument. But the lack of different characters to choose from hurts the game a lot, as does the randomized ability system. Along with the usual time bonuses, there are now these blue orbs that offer 3 random abilities, of which you can only choose 1 at a time. And they all range from useless to insane. I don't know what they were thinking. If you just don't get any abilities that cater to your playstyle, then you're gonna have a way harder time. And it's all entirely luck-based too. It's like they wanted to turn it into a roguelike game, and that's the worst fate I can think of for the Mercenaries. I mean, geez, the Nightmare minigame in Resident Evil 7 was a lot closer to the Mercenaries than this. And to make matters worse, there's a second difficulty which severely reduces the player's defense and gets rid of most of the weapons, leaving you mainly with only a pistol. It's just not fun, and I tried really hard to get into it, but I was clearly just taken for a ride and fooled by the brand name alone. I mean, with the health bars, the miniature and giant enemies, you'd think this was raid mode from Revelations, not Mercenaries. Even then, at least raid mode had multiple characters and a leveling system. There isn't even cooperative play either, come on. It's not terrible, it's still alright for what it is, but it's so disappointing. The last bit of extra content is that really stupid multiplayer shooter that I'm certain no one cares about. Unfortunately, I can't tell you anything about it because it hasn't released yet. My copy of Resident Evil 8 came with a download code for a game that they haven't finished. I don't know what to say. It's not like I was expecting much, but I guess this one's gonna have to wait until later. Well, that's everything. I know I was really harsh on this game, but man, it is disappointing in so many ways. Exploring the castle and all those side paths in the village is awesome, but that barely accounts for half the game, if that. Yeah, you get the Resident Evil 4 weapons in spirit, but it's lacking the variety of the original. Not to mention the overall gameplay length. I'm not against shorter games in the slightest, but Resident Evil 8 doesn't quite feel complete. It gets real close to being something special, but it keeps pulling its punches and never reaches its full potential. And this might be something really petty for me to bring up, but after Resident Evil 7, it's a huge letdown that this game isn't in VR. However, none of this should take away from the positives that the game does present. Fun enemies to fight, beautiful environments to explore, and enough creative moments to make this an adventure worth going through. Even though it misses the mark in too many areas, this is still a great game. Thanks for watching my review on Resident Evil 8 Village. From here on out, at least for a while, expect a new review every week.